Margaret stood in the marble hallway of the Heritage Museum, her tailored emerald dress reflecting the warm afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from years of building something meaningful. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an elegant ponytail, and her gentle smile held both authority and warmth. She watched as Thomas carefully positioned the antique portrait on its display stand. His weathered hands moved with surprising delicacy as he adjusted the ornate golden frame. At 62, Thomas had been the museum's head custodian for nearly 3 decades. His salt and pepper beard framed a face that had seen both hardship and joy, and his kind eyes reflected a lifetime of quiet wisdom. "Thomas," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for moments of vulnerability. "I need to tell you something." He looked up from his work, setting down his cleaning cloth with deliberate care. The portrait between them seemed to watch their conversation. A stern-faced gentleman from another era, painted in rich oils that had somehow survived the passage of time. Margaret took a gentle breath. "The board met yesterday. They're closing us down. The funding has dried up, and this old building needs repairs we simply cannot afford." Her voice caught slightly. "After 40 years, we have 6 months before they sell everything." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. He'd suspected this day might come. Small museums like theirs were disappearing all across the country, victims of changing times and shrinking budgets. "I've spent my whole career here," Margaret continued, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a display case. "My father brought me to this very hall when I was 7 years old. I stood right there, looking up at these same portraits, and decided I wanted to protect beautiful things for other people to discover." "And you have," Thomas said quietly. His voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had watched her pour her heart into this place for 20 years. "Thousands of families have walked these halls because of you." Margaret smiled sadly. "But what good is any of it if it all just disappears?" Thomas stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement after a morning spent on the museum floors. He walked to the portrait they'd been discussing and placed one weathered hand gently on the frame. "You know, Mrs. Harrison," he said, using the formal address he'd maintained even after all these years of friendship, "this painting here, it was damaged when I first started working here. Water damage from a leak in the roof. Everyone said it was ruined." Margaret moved closer, studying the artwork with fresh eyes. "I spent my evenings for 2 months learning about art restoration, borrowed books from the library, watched old instructional videos. My late wife, she used to tease me about it. 'Thomas,' she'd say, 'you're more worried about that old painting than you are about fixing our kitchen faucet.'" A gentle smile crossed his face at the memory. "But she helped me anyway. She'd hold the magnifying glass while I worked on tiny sections with cotton swabs and special solvents. Took us nearly 6 months to bring it back." Margaret looked at the portrait with wonder. She'd never known this story. "The thing is," Thomas continued, "when something has real value, when it brings beauty into the world and connects us to something larger than ourselves, it finds a way to survive. Maybe not in the way we expect, but it survives." He turned to face her directly. "If you can resurrect this museum, Mrs. Harrison, I'll let you steal me away from my retirement." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Thomas, you don't understand. The board has already decided. It would take a miracle. Maybe," he said with quiet conviction, "but I've seen what you can do when you put your heart into something. I've watched you turn this place into more than just a museum. You've made it a home for memories, a place where grandparents can share stories with their grandchildren." That evening, Margaret sat in her office long after the museum had closed. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but heavy with endings. She opened her laptop and began typing, not sure where the words would lead. 3 hours later, she had written something she'd never written before. A love letter to the museum, to the community, to the idea that some things are too precious to let slip away quietly. She posted it on the museum's website and shared it on social media. She wrote about the portrait Thomas had restored, about the children who came for school trips and left with wonder in their eyes, about the elderly visitors who found pieces of their past in the exhibits. The response began slowly. A few shares, a handful of comments. But by morning, something unexpected had happened. The local newspaper picked up the story, then the regional television station. By afternoon, people were calling. A retired teacher offered to volunteer as a docent. A local artist proposed a community art show to raise funds. The coffee shop owner down the street suggested they could host evening fundraising events. But the call that changed everything came from Sarah Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had grown up in the area and now lived across the country. "I read your story," she said when Margaret answered the phone. "I remember coming to your museum with my grandmother when I was little. She taught me to see beauty in old things, to understand that the past has wisdom to offer." Sarah paused, and Margaret could hear the emotion in her voice. "She passed away last year, but she left me her estate. I'd like to endow the museum in her memory, not just enough to save it, but enough to help it thrive." 6 months later, Margaret stood in the same marble hallway, watching as Thomas trained, a young volunteer in the delicate art of caring for antique frames. The afternoon light fell across the portrait he'd restored years before, the painting that had somehow become the symbol of their perseverance. The museum wasn't just saved, it was transformed. New exhibits, expanded programs, and a community that had rediscovered the treasure that had been hiding in plain sight. "You know," Thomas said, joining her in contemplating the portrait, "I never did officially retire." Margaret laughed, a sound full of joy and relief. "I suppose I did steal you away from retirement after all." "The best things in life," Thomas replied with a gentle smile, "are worth the wait and worth fighting for." Outside, children's voices echoed through the halls as another school group discovered the magic of preserving beautiful things. The museum lived on, not just as a building filled with artifacts, but as a testament to the power of hope, community, and the quiet conviction that some treasures are too precious to lose. Character count, 6,847.